Hello and welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening. My name's Andonis Piperoglou and I teach migration and diasporic histories at the University of Melbourne, where I'm speaking to you from this nice spring evening. As someone whose mother was born in British Cyprus, I have a sort of an inherited healthy distrust of exclusivist colonial regimes that I see as tied to contemporary First Nations calls for sovereignty. And it is because of this cultural inheritance that I wish to pay my respects to the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung and Barrarung Bunwurrung people of the Kulin Nation and their elders past, present and emerging, while also acknowledging that sovereignty was never ceded across this delicately undulating country nestled between a great bay to the back of me and the mountains beyond. Tonight, we have the fortune to award the 8th and final Deborah Cass Prize for writers with a migrant background. As a historian who studies migration to Australia, I'm forever glued to the inviting pages of those who write with ideas of migration in mind. The range of voices and literary approaches that grapple with loaded themes tied to migration, themes like adaptation, negotiation, translation, offer us an entry point into alternative, yet for me, growing up as the child of a migrant, familiar stories. Stories, when viewed in unison, act as a kind of symphony of diasporic voices that cleverly respond to rigid framings of our literary culture, and I would say our society at large. Tonight, we will hear from Dan Cass, the brother of Deborah Cass, and Dan will say some words about Deborah and her vision, as well as tell us about the prize and the community of writers it has supported. We will then listen to some great recordings from some special people who have been associated with the prize over the years. This will be followed by a presentation by Alice Pung, a writer known to many of us, I'm sure. Paul Dalgarno, Lee Kofman, and Sisonke, Msimang made up this year's judging committee. And after Alice's talk, Paul will speak on behalf of the judges. We'll then have the great privilege to listen to this year's awardee. So sit back, enjoy tonight's proceedings, and over to you, Dan.
Thank you so much for your scholarly and kind words. And like you, I acknowledge this land was never ceded, and pay my respects to elders past and present. And the prize has been an incredible honour and pleasure for me personally in the 8 years that I've been involved. I'm not a writer, but I love reading. I think books and writers can change the world and make us better, make it more interesting. The prize was the first literary prize in this country for migrant authors, defined by us as writers who'd migrated here or whose parent or parents had. So taking in half the population, a very egalitarian prize. And it was designed specifically to help unpublished writers get into print with a mentor and encouragement and an introduction to Black ink publishers. And the thing that I feel was so incredible for me was how genuine the community was around the prize and how beautifully democratic and community-based writing is, which is something that I learned through the process. You know, we originally had seen the big writing prizes in this country and others, and you see the headline, the winner, the sometimes large bounty of money that is awarded. And, you know, I imagined the whole purpose was to get a winner each year going off to Black ink and getting her book published. And after a few years, this hadn't happened. And I started thinking, well, what's going on? You know, the winners haven't come through, or we haven't designed this properly, or we're not choosing the right books. And then patience. In the last few years, many of those early writers and runners-up have had books published. And so I'll read their names because I'm so impressed. These writers, winners and runners-up from 2015 to 2018, had between them 9 books published already. So Moreno, Giovannoni, The Fireflies of Autumn, Melanie Cheng, Australia Day and Room for a Stranger, Monica Rozeski, The Archaeology of a Dream, Editor Muchik, Between Before and After, Jessie 2, You Should Have Told Me We Have Nothing Left, and Lonely Girl is a Dangerous Thing, Emily Sun, Vociferate, and Sume Tan, Lake Malibu and Other Stories. And so, in fact, I'm very optimistic that as the winners and runners-up from the subsequent 5 years of the prize work through their ideas and their words on paper, I think we might end up with even more books from the alumni in the future. So I'm just incredibly, really humbled that in 8 years, the prize helped bring 9 books into print. And when I say that, I'm relating to you that many of the alumni of the prize have said, even just being on a short list and considered helped them get up in the morning or the night, whenever it is writers do their work, and just persevere until they have the manuscript, presenting it to the publishers and getting it into print. So that to me tells us so much about what writing is and how intimately it is part of a community, which I guess I should have known more acutely, but now I really do. Now, there's too many people to thank everyone by name who've given their time and their wisdom and their love of writing to the prize. I've only got 3 minutes and the clock's ticking, but I really have to single out Alice Pung, who's speaking tonight, OAM now, and Christos, Tsiolkas and Tony Ayres, the inaugural judges. Thank you for lending your big names to our little prize. The current judges, Lee Kofman, Paul Dalgarno, who's speaking tonight, Sisonke, Msimang, thank you so much for what you're doing to help us end on a bang. And also I must mention the tireless voluntary committee members, mostly who were friends of Deborah's, my sister, who've worked so hard for so long. James Button and May Lamb, Tanya Paxton, Helen Stitt, Carolyn Jordan, Kevin Murray, Vic Miles, Jane Emery more recently, Moreno and Mel in the early days. To the many shortlisters who've made it possible to run the prize and read through all the entries and get them to the esteemed judges for the final listing. The generosity of the 8 mentors who've just been the heart and soul of the work that's inspired the writers to get the books done. The donors who collectively gave probably over $70,000, I guess, by the time we wind up this year, which is just incredible and kind, and thank you for that. And as I said, I fully expect more books will come. So look, I'll wind up in a minute, but I just wanted to also say that, you know, Deborah, my sister, died younger than she should have, before she had a chance to be a writer. And this was the most incredible tribute for her. The idea of the prize was my mother's, and sadly, Shirley passed away earlier this year, as did my father, Moss. But they were really heartened by the prize and all the love of the people who made it possible and the incredible work of the writers who produced their books. So it's really been an incredible honour for me and for the whole Cass family to have Deborah remembered in such a beautiful and impactful and very democratic prize. So thank you, and I hope to see you at a book launch somewhere in the real world sometime, all of you, and give you all a big hug. Thank you.
Welcome. Judging the Deborah Cass Prize, being involved in the prize is one of the great honours of my professional life. I mean that quite genuinely, in the sense of what that word honour means, which is, for me, both being given a gift to be able to participate in the prize, and also a responsibility, which proved a great pleasure, because it unnerved that there was so much great writing that was coming out of this place called Australia, which is made up of so many stories, some of them stretching back thousands and thousands of years, and so many of them recent stories that come from another great history of migration to this country. And when I think back on some of the prize winners, I'm just joyous, because it was an astonishing, revelatory exciting period being a judge on the prize, and I thank everyone for giving me that opportunity. It's also an honour because Deborah Cass was one of the great souls on this planet, and Deborah, I hope the prize and its legacy and its history and its integrity is a worthy gift to the person you are. Thank you.
Tonight is an evening marked with melancholic joy for me. Joy because the Deborah Cass Prize has gone from strength to strength, and I've had the privilege and pleasure of witnessing this and playing a very, very small part in it all. Melancholic because, like all good things, it must come to an end. My shortlisting for the inaugural Deborah Cass Prize in 2015 remains one of the most thrilling experiences of my career. I was honoured when I was invited to join the prize committee in 2017, and then again when I was asked to participate in the judging. The alumni of this prize is hugely impressive, and the validation and attention that the award garners has provided important stepping stones for many migrant writers in Australia, myself included. I'd like to thank the Cass family and the committee for having invited me to be part of it. You'd be hard-pressed to find a bunch of more talented and resourceful and dedicated people. In Chinese culture, the number 8 is thought to be lucky because it sounds like the word for prosper. And so what an auspicious time to be bidding farewell to this prize in its 8th year. May the writing community of Australia continue to prosper for having had it, if only briefly, in their lives.
In 2015, I won the inaugural Deborah Cass Prize. My distinguished judges, Alice Pung, Christos, Tsiolkas, and Tony Ayres, gave me the courage to keep writing. Thanks to the prize, I was able to finish writing my book, The Fireflies of Autumn, in Tuscany, in the village where it's set. I had a mentor to help me finish my manuscript and a guarantee that Black Ink would consider it for publication. I don't think my book would have been published without the support of the Deborah Cass Prize. Miles Franklin winner A.S. Patrick, the son of migrants, once asked, "Why don't we see more immigrant stories? We have all this richness in our culture, and yet you look around publishing and there are so many rural historical experiences and everyone's Anglo-Saxon." The Deborah Cass Prize has helped fill this gap in our national storytelling. Thank you.
My name is Rafeif Ismail, and I'm so honored to be joining you for the final awards night for the Deborah Cass Prize for Writing. The Deborah Cass Prize for Writing has had a monumental impact on the creative landscape of literary Australia. It's provided pathways of publication for so many authors from refugee and migrant backgrounds. I know that it had a huge impact on my own career. Winning the prize changed the trajectory of my creative journey. And although I'm sad that this chapter has ended, I know that the community that the prize has built around it is going to go from strength to strength. I want to say a huge thank you to the judges, the prize committee, and to everyone who's helped the prize keep going for as long as it has. I hope that we can continue the journey of supporting diverse voices and creating sustainable practice together. And good luck to all the nominees for tonight. You're going to be part of something super great.
Wow. Those were beautiful reflections and most touching. And I would say, indeed, let's continue to prosper. We will now hear from Alice Pung, a writer who has had an immeasurable impact on our vibrant contemporary literary culture. When I think about the range of voices that have budded and then flowered due to the Growing Up in Australia series, my mind always returns to Alice's edited collection, Growing Up Asian in Australia. This text, along with Alice's commitment to nourishing and supporting aspiring writers, has opened us up to refreshing and enticing stories that I think offer a more true picture of our complex selves and environments. Alice, like the vision behind the Deborah Cass Prize, is a genuine gem. in our intellectual culture. And it's for this reason that I'm honoured to pass you on to her so she can share some words about the prize.
Hi, everyone. I think the host has permission to start my video. So let me start my video. It's a great honour to be here. And as Dr. Melanie Cheng said, it is a bit of a sadness as well, because this is a final Deborah Cass Prize in its 8th year, 8 being a very auspicious number. And I'd like to mention something that Dan Cass said earlier on. He said, you know, the early crop of names, the early list, the early shortlist, when he waited and they weren't yielding many results, that was because they wrote one story for the Deborah Cass. And a book on average for a writer, a literary writer, usually takes 4 to 5 years if we're lucky, if we don't have the commitment of children or full-time jobs to go to, or if we are unsure of the book industry and have no idea how to go about it. So the fact that so many books have popped up, even in that early crop, those early years where Christos, myself and Tony were judging, is just testament to the power of this prize. I remember Deborah's voice being so strong. I read one of her pieces earlier on, many years ago, when I was judging this prize to get a sense of what she was like as a person, as a sister, as a daughter, as a mother. And she wrote a beautiful piece about Dan and her mother, Shirley. So we feel the life of Shirley here with us tonight, and also about your grandmother, a very wonderful cook who had interesting ways of spelling her recipes. And it's a family of narrators, a family of orators, and a family of writers, because a year after the inaugural prize, Dan himself wrote an article for the Guardian newspaper where he mentioned this beautiful story about when Deborah was growing up. To boost her confidence, your mum and dad, Dan, allowed her to enact little plays. They actively encouraged this. And you wrote that she found a strong voice for herself by imagining herself as other people. Empathy made her strong. And that really captures the spirit of your sister for all of us. Now, unfortunately, some people lack imaginative empathy in this day, and they've always lacked imaginative empathy. Some people might have a glut of words. Some people might have been born with books on the shelves. And Australian publishing, unfortunately, has not always sought diverse voices. And where Australian publishing has sought diverse voices, they have been very particular about the diverse voices that they've sought. So they've been very straight and narrow about a certain migrant narrative. And about a decade and a half ago, this was a narrative of the best-selling, the happiest refugee. And what this Deborah Cass Prize offered to the writing community, firstly in Melbourne and then later in all the other states, was an expansion of the possibilities of the immigrant story. Now, you might think this is a cliche, or that this might sound counterintuitive, that when you limit the stories to immigrant stories, you're actually expanding the possibility of what these stories can be. Christos, Tony and I, as well as Dan and some committee members, had initial discussions and thought, are we really limiting ourselves in the first few years by picking immigrant stories? And when we came to read many of the shortlisted pieces and the submissions, we realised that, ironically, by narrowing it down to stories of migrants, we really gave people the opportunity to be heard, to write in their own voices and styles. We weren't big publishers. We weren't people that they had to please. We weren't, assessing them for anything except their story of migration or a sense of not belonging. And when the first book came out by Moreno, which Christos, Tony and I wanted to pick the books that were outliers, that is, that no big mainstream publisher would touch with a 40-foot pole, because the books were so brilliant and so different and so unlike anything that had been published before, that the voices were so unique that commercial publishers would never have recognised these voices. So when Moreno's book came out, we were so proud, and I gave it to one of my Greek friends, And he's a man of few words. He read it and he said to me, "This is the best book I have read all year." And he said, historically Greeks and Italians are rivals and sometimes enemies, but this book speaks to my family. This book is about the village my parents came from, even though they're Greek. This book is my grandparents. This book is about the brutality of humans towards animals. This book brings everything to life for me. And that was his book of the year. And so when you take a very particular, very unique, imitable voice, you get this story that speaks so beautifully and so universally. And that's exactly what we did, Christos, Tony and I, in all of those 3 years. And there were some stories that were beautifully written, stories in the shortlist that we knew would find a publisher. We look for the outlier. We look for that voice that the commercial publishers would not touch. And we thought, this is the voice Australia needs to hear. And it's because you had a very sympathetic yet discerning audience. We were judges, first and foremost, besides being immigrants or children of immigrants. So we've judged many awards between us. And this year you have very wonderful judges, Lee, Paul and Sisonke. And so I'm very sad, and it's a final year of the award. And I'd like to acknowledge the work of the committee, but more particularly the work of Dan as the spearhead of this prize. And I'm heartbroken by your losses, particularly this year. And I want to say this to you, Dan, as someone who has known personal loss in my family and the loss of a sibling. Your prize meant everything, not just to the winners and the shortlistees, but to the judges and me personally. And I want to acknowledge that you're a wonderful, wonderful brother and a wonderful son, and your family are so lucky to have you. And I hope there is a future for this prize and that the Deborah Cass name lives on. Thank you so much for having me be part of your prize. Thank you so much, Dan.
Thank you so much, Alice. That was just beautiful. I mean, we're definitely getting a sense of the power of change, of rethinking our world, of genuinely contributing to a kind of new wave of Australian literary opportunity. So thank you so much, Alice. We will now see a slideshow of our shortlisted writers, and then we'll hear from Paul Dalgarno, who will present our 2022 Judges Report.
Hi there, everyone. I'd like to thank, first of all, everyone at the Deborah Cass Prize, not least Deborah's family, Dan included, obviously, for the community they've created with this prize over the last 8 years, and the light they've helped shine on writers from migrant backgrounds. Christos, Melanie, and Alice have all already said it very well, that this prize has created an incredible legacy. And I think the thing that's very obvious to me is that it's a humane prize in the sense that it's very human. It centers the humans, the stories about humans, and it's an absolute pleasure to be part of the judging panel for this year. There were 99 stories submitted this year, which was then whittled down to a shortlist of 11. As you might be thinking, that's an unusual number to have in a shortlist. That's because it would usually be 10, but it was pretty much impossible to get it down to 10, which is a problem born of the fact that the stories really were of an extremely high quality. And it was very difficult to even get it down to the 11, never mind get it down to the actual winner at the end of that. I'd like to congratulate the 11 writers who were shortlisted and whose quotes from whose pieces we've just seen on the screen. They're incredible quotes and indeed incredible stories and excerpts from larger works. Congratulations on that, but also to everyone who entered the prize. By entering a prize of this sort, of any sort really, you're making a statement of intent as a writer, that you have something to say and you'd like to find an audience. And so my best and maybe only useful advice to you would be keep going. If you feel you have stories to tell, and you obviously do, there's a very good chance there are people who want or even need to read what you have to say. So please just push ahead. Now, from the 11 shortlisted stories, the judges, Sisonke, Lee, and myself had a difficult task. The truth is that all of those stories were strong for different reasons and shone in different ways, whether it was a particularly strong characterization or the narrative voice or the strength and uniqueness of the story, the plot itself. But after much deliberation, we decided on the following 3. I'll go in reverse order, as is customary. The second runner-up for this year's prize is a story that bowled us over with its language, its evocative imagery, and its characterization. Give just a couple of short examples of the language and how well and quickly it paints people, place, and atmosphere. I'll quote, "The smell of starched uniforms and morning breaths filled the car along with Uncle Balan's hair oil and Preeti's cream crackers." And another quote, "My favorite part was when we drove past the airfield where the Australian fighter jets were parked, gleaming under the smoked, watery sun." It's beautiful language in a story that is filled with such beautiful language and atmosphere. And so it's a great pleasure to announce Melon Shine by Min Chow as the second runner-up in this year's prize. Congratulations to Min Chow. The first runner-up is a story that contrasts a rural working class setting in a sugarcane farm in an unnamed location with literary allusions and references, not least, but especially references and a kind of interplay with the Jungle Book. It's a story of childhood dread and foreboding delivered with the power of a fable, which sounds a lot easier to do than it actually is. Quite often such attempts are kind of marked by trying but not quite getting there. The story actually gets there, so it's very accomplished, covers a lot of ground very quickly, and all 3 of us judges were extremely impressed by the world the story evoked and the manner in which it was written. I'd like to wish the author, as with the other judges, I'm sure, the very best of luck going forwards. It's an incredible piece of writing. And so this year's first runner-up goes to Ka by Nilofar Zimmerman. Well done, Nilofar. And so to this year's winner. When I said at the start, there was lots of debate and lots of discussion about which stories were our favorites this year and why, that was true. But when it came to this story, the winner of this year's prize, all 3 judges came out of the gates arguing on its behalf. It was really the first story. It wasn't the first chronologically that we read in the shortlist pile, but it was the first one we spoke about. And it was the last one we spoke about. And I think we spoke about it in the middle of our judging meeting too. So that gives a sense of how much we were drawn to it. Why is it so good? Well, primarily voice. We're in the hands of a first-person narrator that all but leaps off the page. A narrator who, from the first word to the last, has us enthralled and eager for more. A narrator who's an international student who's come to Australia from the Philippines and lives in a 5-bedroom share house in Hawthorne. The lightness of the prose, the humour, which is something I very much appreciate, as the other judges, and the ease with which the narrator keeps us invested in this story is matched by some pretty wonderful and deep observations about human nature, but also about the narrator's inner world. Just a couple of small examples of that. This is quoting: "It always seemed like my subconscious took care of things until my consciousness caught up." And then, also the narrator, "Back in Melbourne, I started having these moments when the world appeared to go dim and I would suddenly be alone in my head." And there are also moving and lightly worn reflections on grief, whether that's lost family, lost culture, or more accurately, the in-betweenness of cultures that will be familiar to all migrants, or indeed the loss of a recent, clearly meaningful relationship to the narrator. To quote again on this subject of separation. "Separation is like death," the narrator tells us at one point. "Except in death, we nurse the ache, knowing fully well that we cannot unbury the body." Lee, Sisonke, and I are very excited to see this story and this writer develop, and I look forward to rushing out and buying this when it becomes, whichever form it becomes, a story, a novella, a novel. I'll be buying it and reading it, and I'm sure recommending it to everyone. I'm extremely pleased then to announce that the 2022 Deborah Cass Prize for Writing goes to Anneliz Marie Erese for her wonderful story, International. Congratulations, Anneliz. And now I believe we're going to hear from Anneliz, and I think, if we're lucky, have a short reading from that winning story.
Thank you so much, Paul. Those are beautiful words. And I'd like to thank everyone behind the Deborah Cass Prize for your work in the past 8 years. It should go without saying that it is an immense honor to receive this award, and I am proud to be among an incredible shortlist this year. To receive support and appreciation of these stories, including mine, is extremely affirming. I'd also like to take the opportunity to address the theme of my piece. As Paul has already mentioned, it's about an international student in Melbourne. It is an experience that is personal to me and to more than a quarter of university students in Australia, more than half of which has experienced loneliness or isolation while studying. We are a cohort that is part of Australia's economy, the third largest export sector in Australia in 2019. And yet we are commonly exploited in the workplace. Young women of color are sexualized, and we are often invisible because we are considered temporary. And so tonight I will be reading a series of vignettes from my piece where we find our named narrator as she is grappling with loneliness. Back in Melbourne, I started having these moments when the world appeared to go dim, and I would suddenly be alone in my head, although I could be waiting to cross at the lights or in line at the self-checkout, and my mind would go back to the dark apartment where I used to live. When it happened, I shook my head vigorously or pinched the skin on my palm over and over again. In those moments, there was nothing more important than getting from point A to point B. Through this, I discovered movement. I developed a routine of walking in early mornings and stopping by at the corner cafe. Then I'd continue to walk on with a cup in hand. These mornings were like finding a toehold on a cliff I didn't know I was on. It saved me, to say it simply, in that it took me away from myself. The poet Arthur Rimbaud had loved walking too. He'd had swollen knees from all the walks he took, that his leg had had to be amputated, What cause was so noble to implore oneself to a point of dismemberment? Rambo walked from city to city, across deserts, took weeks and weeks of journey on foot. He'd considered himself a passerby. I'm a pedestrian, nothing more, he'd said. On his last days, he'd been excited about having a wooden leg. It was all he was talking about. His last words had been, "Quick, they're expecting us." Who was expecting me? I wanted to arrive for nothing and no one. For an hour or two, I was all bones, one with the neighborhood trees and Victorian bungalows and closed Chinese restaurants. I was the leash on the dogs and the dogs themselves and the owners of the dogs walking the dogs. I was the yoga place and the mat and the plants behind the glass windows and the baguettes and croissants from the bakery. I was the clouds and the blue hidden behind the clouds, and I was the peach in the sky and the cars and the tram passing by. There was nothing that wasn't me, and I was lost in this rhythmic dance with the world that I forgot I was simultaneously suffering. Nighttime would come, as always. I was still trying to create a habit of sleeping alone. I would place one pillow in the middle of my queen-sized bed with every intention of spreading myself. But in the morning, I would always find myself on the right side, close to the windows, in a position that didn't look like I just happened to roll there. In my sleep, I was making space for him on the empty side, leaving room for an absent body. I was clinging desperately for anything to fill the space that I started filling it with books and bags and used tissue. Something, anything. But nothing seemed to work. Separation is like death, except in death, we nurse the ache, knowing fully well we cannot unbury the body. In separation, the body just leaves. There is nothing to bury. I considered getting a smaller bed, but in the end, I wanted to face the ghost that seemed intent to sleep beside me. A woman moaning, gasping, followed by a man's grunt. The particular orchestra of sex. Flesh on flesh on flesh. I could tell the exact moment he put his hand over her mouth, the muffled cry in her bite on his palm. A quick flip over, and now he's on top of her. Something happens to a woman pressed down by the heavy weight of someone she wants. She becomes weightless herself, initially floating on a lagoon, then sinking down to the bottom of it. She welcomes the entering, soaking wet with anticipation. Then the fullness comes over, drowns her to the core. Nothing is left dry or empty. If there is a kind of heaven where you're gagging as your lungs fill with water, then this is it. Perhaps this is why humans are obsessed with sex as much as they are obsessed with death. They are one and the same. The thud of the headboard, the wall moving. For a second, I feared I was back in the old apartment, back at the end of the days when it had begun. But as I sat up, I saw the full moon through the window, the books on the floor, the sparse bedroom, the bed that was mine. The sounds were coming from the paramedics' room next door. I lay back down again, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. It was so quiet, it was easy to tell what was happening. He was kissing her now, his tongue inside her mouth, the rustling of hair on the pillow, their bodies adjusting to each other. I yearned for the clumsiness of it all, the learning that transpires between two people naked before each other. My hand slowly moved down under my blanket, underneath the cotton garment covering what was between my legs. I stared up at the ceiling. There was nothing. With my eyes open and with the sound of their lips together, my fingers found a spot that weakened me, moved there slowly, slightly, gliding and gliding, until I was drowning too in heaven and crying on earth. Thank you.
And Liz, that was just beautiful. It is just so touching to hear the words spoken, a writer's own words spoken, and I felt very much the emotion of those early morning walks and the the journeying that you took us on there. So just thank you. Binakbati kita, congratulations, very much heartfelt. In a marked celebratory tone, I'd very much like to thank Dan Cass for his role in making this prize a reality, for enlivening and making true Deborah Cass's vision. I'd like to thank Alice Pung for her words tonight, our past and present judges, and particularly Paul Dalgarno's words earlier, our mentors, and of course, our writers. In the spirit of what this prize has fostered, I'd like to spur our writers to continue journeying towards new horizons, to do what they can to keep giving us new important voices that are, as Alice said, are all too often ignored by commonplace publishers, if you will. Finally, family-initiated prizes such as this, the Deborah Cass Prize, rely on an immense amount of voluntary labour. Indeed, such a prize often cannot exist without people dedicating large amounts of time and resources, energies, parts of their day to support young writers, aspiring writers, new talent. So we'd like to thank you for all that you've done over the years and wish you all good futures and new possibilities in the years ahead. So thank you and good night.